Hey there, everyone. This is Gregg Schutze for ReadyForTheDraft.com, and this is the Ready for the Draft podcast, getting you ready for the 2020 NFL Draft, which is set to begin April 23rd, Las Vegas, Nevada. The backdrop will be those Bellagio fountains. I can see it now, and I can't wait. It's going to be epic. Now, this is episode 22 of the 2020 podcast series, which is also known as part 2 of the pre-draft edition. Now, there are 337 combine invites for the NFL Combine, which is set to begin next week, Lucas Oil Stadium, Indianapolis, Indiana. And last episode, we talked about 174 offensive players who received their combine invites. This week, we're going to transition to the defensive side of the football. 151 total combine invites. You also have 12 special teams players who also got their invites. We're going to touch on them towards the end of this podcast. We're not going to forget about our special teams performers as well. So when you're talking about the defensive side of the ball, and really what I want to do with this podcast, you're talking about the combine, we're going to compare the 2019 draft class to what we're seeing and what we expect to see with the 2020 class. And the reason why I do that is we already have the results of the 2019 combine. We can take a look at why some of these guys did not get drafted, who had some of the performances that really, set the world on fire, kept your attention, really raised their draft stock, and who are some of those guys? Where's that comparable player for this year's draft class? So that's really one of the things that I definitely want to do. And when you're talking about the combine, when you think about combine, you're validating what you saw out on the field. They talk about this being the biggest job interview for all of these players. And really what you're talking about is, you're going to have guys that'll be, they'll be bench pressing, they'll be doing the broad jump, vertical jump, 3-cone drill, obviously the 40. And so you're watching these guys perform, and you're looking for the speed, the power, the athleticism. You're putting them through the drills. Can they bend? Can they, where are they flexible? Is there stiffness in their hips? Can they turn and run? There are going to be a lot of things that these coaches are looking at, and really they're validating what they saw out on the game, on the game film. Because if a guy shows up playing well on the film and you see that fluidity and the athleticism, you're expecting to see the same thing at the combine. So when you're watching them at the combine, there may be guys that'll turn heads and say, wow, look at that. I was not expecting to see that type of athleticism. And they're going to send the coaches and the scouts back to the game film to watch more film on those guys. There are also going to be some guys that you're going to look at and go, wow, I was not expecting him to be as stiff as he looked in person. That may also have some teams questioning what's going on. Now, obviously, combine, you're also talking about medicals. You're also going to be talking about interviews. So we're going to point out some of the guys that are going to need to nail those interviews. They're going to have to make sure that those medicals check out okay. So we're going to make sure that we touch on all of those guys as we move through this podcast. And really, we've got, like I said, 151 players to cover. I don't think we're going to be talking about every single one of them, but we've got a lot to cover. So let's just go ahead and jump right into things. So we're talking first about the edge rushers. The edge rushers, those are the guys that are making big money, putting pressure on the quarterback. Coming off the edge, that bend, coming around as quickly as possible, beating that defense, that offensive tackle, however which way they can, whether it's with speed, with power, with their hands. You're going to be seeing that time and time again, edge rushers coming off, and they're really at a premium because there aren't too many guys who can come off the edge and disrupt a game. Those are the guys that are going to be making top money. So the edge rusher, what's interesting is, and I've been looking at the NFL website, and they haven't actually divided out the edge rushers. And last year they did that, and I really appreciated the fact that they did so. There were 24 guys that they targeted as edge rushers, and they put them all together so you could really kind of get an idea of what these guys did, and you can compare them one to another and really see them all go through the drills. Now this year, if you look at this year's draft class, I'm looking at 9 linebackers who are would be considered edge rushers. So, like Kalavin Chason out of LSU, Zach Bond of Wisconsin, Carter Coughlin out of Minnesota, Tipa Nalai of Utah State, Anthony Jennings of Alabama, Terrell Lewis of Alabama, Darrell Taylor of Tennessee, Josh Uche of Michigan, and Curtis Weaver of Boise State, all listed as linebackers. And they'll be going through a lot of the linebacker drills, which I can't hate on that because you want to see some of these linebackers. Can they drop into coverage? Are they going to be uncomfortable? A guy like Curtis Weaver, putting his hand in the dirt, quite a bit there for Boise State. Is he someone who's going to be comfortable dropping back into coverage? Terrell Lewis, the same thing. Is Terrell Lewis a one-trick pony coming with speed off the edge, or can he drop into coverage? So I can't hate on that too much, but really you want to kind of compare a lot of these edge rushers together, and you don't have that, because when you're talking about the defensive line, you've got all the defensive tackles, all of the defensive ends, edge rushers, everyone all smacked together, and you've got 46 guys that you're going to be looking at. I really did the math, looked at it, 24 edge rushers, 22 defensive tackles. So when I say edge rushers, you're talking about the defensive ends, although some of these guys are probably not going to be a defensive end at the next level. They'll probably end up being 34 outside linebackers. But, with this group, those 24 edge rushers, that's also going to include some of the guys that we're probably going to be expecting to be some 5 techniques. There might even be some defensive tackles that are going to end up being 5 techniques when it's all said and done. When you look at last year's draft class, and just to remind you, that draft class included Nick Bosa, Cleveland Ferrell, Rashawn Gary, Montez Sweat, LJ Collier, all taken in round number 1. So there were a total of 29 edge rushers, I guess you could say, that were drafted. 11 that you could constitute as potential linebackers. 27 of those guys were actually invited to the combine. So the only 2 that weren't, you're talking Jalen Ferguson, who had an off-field issue, so he wasn't invited to the combine, still ended up a day 2 pick going to the Ravens. And then Quentin Bell was a 7th rounder out of Prairie View A&M going to the Raiders. One of those FCS guys who ended up not getting the combine invite, but very athletic, and ultimately did get himself drafted late in the draft. So you're looking at that, and the majority of these edge rushers, they were invited to the combine. So very few, if they weren't invited to the combine a season ago, chances are they weren't going to get drafted. Those are going to be guys that they're going to target as priority free agents and such. There were 24 edge rushers, as I said, that were invited. 6 of them did not get drafted. And when you look at these guys, I think there's some things that definitely jumped out to me. The guys that were not drafted were Malik Carney out of UNC, kind of an undersized guy, 6'2", 251. And, the production, he had the exact same measurables as DeAndre Walker, but DeAndre Walker, he did fell all the way to the 5th round, but I think his overall body of work ended up winning out. You look at a guy like Porter Gustin out of USC, big guy, 6'4", 255, repped out 225, 31 times, 35.5-inch vertical leap, 4.69 40. But the medicals were a huge concern for Porter Gustin. And then the other thing is this guy's a very good straight line athlete, but he's so stiff in the hips. And that was really the biggest issue. That's what you were looking for at the combine. And really, there was some validation to that. You watched him in the drills and he looked very stiff, really not able to bend around that edge. And that's really what you're looking for with your edge rushers. He was an undrafted free agent, ended up by the end of the season making a roster and getting some playing time. But when you're talking about drafting a guy, there were enough red flags there with Porter Gustin that he ended up not getting drafted. And then CC Jefferson out of Florida. I think this is the most glaring issue. 6'1", 266, ran a 5'0", 240. When you're talking about edge rushers, you're talking about the explosiveness coming off the edge. And when you're running a 5'0", 240, man, there are offensive linemen and defensive tackles running faster than a 5.02. So I think that really put him behind the 8 ball and really was trying to build a better case for himself to be drafted, and that just was for naught. I think of on the offensive side, I mentioned in the last podcast, Elijah Holyfield. I think that was a perfect example. Here's a big bruising running back. You're expecting to see some power out of him. And he ran in the 4.7s, just didn't look very fast at all, didn't look very explosive. And then he followed that up with a 29.5-inch vertical leap. So no real lower body explosiveness out of a guy that big. And so I think his draft stock really took a huge hit, and he just really wasn't able to recover. So that was a huge concern there. So when you're looking at this draft class, class, you're going to be asking yourself, how many of these guys are ultimately going to end up getting drafted? And obviously, when you're talking about the draft, it has to start with Chase Young out of Ohio State. Chase Young is an absolute beast. This guy is a game wrecker. Now, look, I heard someone, some of these draft experts that are out there, these fellow draft experts, and they're actually saying that Chase Young, his draft stock took a hit because he wasn't as productive when he came back from suspension. And I would beg to differ. Yes, he didn't have double-digit sack games, but, I mean, what more do you want from a guy who, had 16 and a half sacks on the year? You look at Chase Young, and while, yes, he was not getting home to the quarterback, how many times was Chase Young in the backfield putting pressure on the quarterback? Even if he doesn't get home, he's still affecting that play. And that's one of the things with Chase Young is even when he's not getting home, you have to know where he is. You have to identify where he is on the field at all times because of the explosiveness, because of the power, because of his hands. And really, I'm excited to see just how fast he's going to run in the combine. Is he going to run a sub 4.6? What's he going to run there? I think he's going to blow everyone away with his bench press numbers as well. And then the athleticism, the vertical leap, I think he's going to jump through the roof. And then watching him in the drills, that's really what's going to be fun. You're going to see that lateral quickness. You're going to see the hands, just the explosive power, to his punch because he's able to drive guys back, get him off balance, and then a quick arm over and shoots inside. He's not just a guy who's going to be bending around the edge. Now, when you want to really watch is some of that ankle flexion. You're talking about the flexibility. Can he bend at the hips, dip in his shoulder and really able to run that tight turn, that core strength to really run a tight turn as you're bending around that edge. But you're also talking about that ankle flexion because if you have stiff ankles, you're not able to really put your body at an extreme angle rushing the quarterback. That was what Brian Burns was so good at Florida State. What was the ankle flexibility with him, the ankle flexion, his ability to just really put himself at these odd angles to be able to, as he's turning the corner, get to the quarterback and affect the play. Chase Young, I think, is going to be a guy that everyone's going to be talking about with his explosiveness. He's going to be a lot of fun to watch. And I think he's one of those guys that you have to tune in to the combine. If nothing else, Young is at the very end of this group, whether it's the defensive ends or it's going to be, I'm not sure exactly how they're going to run it. If it is going to be the edge rushers or the defensive line, he's still going to be at the very end, but it's going to be worth the wait. I promise you. So when you flip from Chase Young and his explosiveness to a guy like AJ Epinesa. Now, AJ Epinesa, very productive guy from the time that he was a 5-star recruit coming into Iowa. I think he was the highest recruited player. The high, I think, a 5-star recruit there for Iowa, 6'4", 280 pounds, the junior. As a sophomore, he was playing behind Anthony Nelson and Parker Hesse, and he still led the Big Ten in sacks with 10.5. Follows that up with 11.5 sacks in 2019. Had a couple of games where he dominated. Especially that Minnesota game. He put on that game film, and Sam Schluter, the left tackle, just didn't really know what to do. AJ Epinesa is so good at creating that soft edge with his power. And that's the thing. He's not all that explosive. I think you're going to see some stiffness in the hips and the drills. But what he's so good at is the power and his hands, his ability to really, drive guys back. He gets his hands right underneath the offensive lineman's armpit to kind of get him off balance. And then he'll use the real quick arm over or a slap and rip. And he's got the edge, does a decent job flattening out, but again, it's a stiffness, and that's really going to be the biggest concern, I think, for a lot of people is how stiff is this guy going to be? Is he going to be someone that, he's not going to be able to overpower all these offensive tackles at the next level? Is he going to be more of a 5 technique? And really, you look at J.J. Watt, he's been a 5 technique his entire career at Houston, and he's done just fine. So it'll be interesting to see AJ Epinesa, how he really looks there at the combine. So if we're talking about edge rushers, I've got to dip into the linebacker crew, the group that is labeled as linebackers, and talk about Clavin Chason out of LSU, 6'4", 250 pounds. When you think of LSU, you think of Barkevius Kiki Mingo, and then that's a big concern because Kiki Mingo was a top 10 pick, and the production just never matched the potential. there at the next level. And you look at Chason, if you just looked at the stats and the numbers, 13.5 tackles for loss, 6.5 sacks, 60 tackles. Now, this is a guy who was coming off the edge. He was not a one-trick pony. You can't just look at the production and say, well, he just didn't get home. And yes, that is true. But this is a guy who was winning, and I think he's actually going to be a better pro than he was a college athlete because of his ability, to not only rush the passer but set the edge against the run. Sets really a hard edge. Does a great job with his hands, getting himself free, stacking and shedding, using his long arms. You're going to see that length. He's going to get measured at the combine. Length to able to get underneath his blocker, stack, shed, get to the ball and make a play. But he also has that bend, and we're talking about the flexibility, the ankle flexion. He's this year's Brian Burns, in my opinion. He's not quite the as productive as Brian Burns was at Florida State, but he has the same type of athleticism, and that's one of the things that you're really going to see with him is his ability to get low coming off the ball, but also the power. I was so surprised. He has these long arms, and he extends right into that offensive tackle, and he drives that guy off the ball. The speed to power with K'Lavon Chason is special. And so that's one of the things I'd love to see him. He's going to be lining up with the linebackers and a lot of athletes, but I'd love to see him in an edge rusher type group and really showcase some of that speed. I'm looking at the Falcons sitting there at number 16. They love those types of athletes. Thomas Dimitrov and Dan Quinn. Vic Beasley may be a casualty. If that's the case, I think Chason can end up being that guy for the Falcons to really bridge that gap and really take over the edge rushing ability. So when you're talking about some of these edge rushers at the linebacker position, and again, if they're going to be doing that, we're going to be having to go back and forth between linebackers and defensive linemen. How about Curtis Weaver? This is one of those guys that I think is really intriguing for me. Very consistent. This guy, 47.5 tackles for loss, 34 sacks. And I've compared him to Derek Barnett. I think similar body type when you look at the two of them. Weaver 6'3", 265 out of Boise State. And I'm really going to be curious to see if the measurables and the times really match up with Derek Barnett. I think that's a comparable situation there. I think the biggest thing is Weaver is still a little soft against the run in comparison to Barnett, which is why Weaver isn't really being talked about as a potential top 10 like Barnett was. I think Weaver is probably going to fall into the teens or the early 20s, but I think he's not getting out of that. He's going to be one of those guys. If teams are looking for a consistent edge rusher, then Weaver's going to be at the top of their list. Now, Zach Bond is another edge rusher who's really going to be a 34 outside linebacker. He's 6'3", 245. It wasn't until this season that he really got a chance to put everything together. 19.5 tackles for loss, 12.5 sacks. And you're talking about the explosiveness coming off the edge. This is a guy who can definitely bend coming off the corner. Has really powerful hands. Showed an ability to set the edge against the run, had 75 tackles, so he was definitely productive from a tackling standpoint as well, and a guy who could drop into coverage a little bit. I think you're going to see some athleticism from Zach Bond that a lot of people were not expecting, and I think his draft stock is going to continue to rise. I think he's someone who, people aren't really talking about him as a late first rounder. I think you really have to. I think a team like Miami could potentially look at Zach Bond there with their last pick because they've got 3 picks in the first round. Look at Zach Bond as a potential guy there. He's somebody that I think you're going to really see some of that explosiveness and really going to catch some eyes and turn some heads. So staying in that linebacker group, Terrell Lewis, 6'5", 252, Alabama stud outside linebacker. This is going to be the guy who I think is going to be a workout warrior. 2018, you'll remember he had the ACL tear, was out for the year. 2019 comes back. Don't just look at the stats, just 11.5 tackles for loss, 6 sacks. But this was a guy who showed some sideline to sideline range at times playing the run. A guy who was just so explosive coming off the edge. For a guy his size, he is pretty darn explosive. And that length, that's going to be something that's going to be coveted. You want to see what he's going to run at the combine. You want to see as he goes through the drills just how, is there any stiffness to his hips? Because the game film shows you that this guy getting after the quarterback, the biggest thing that I worry for him is a lot of times his sole goal and sole purpose is getting after the quarterback, that he loses sight of the run and loses contain at times. And that's one of the biggest things that I worry about him is he just going to be a situational pass rusher? Teams are always looking for that. And those are some of the guys that still are going to make a ton of money because they are able to affect the game getting after the quarterback. But, is he worthy of a first round grade? Yeah, that's debatable at this point to really see where that's going to be. So if we flip back to the defensive line group, one of the guys that I'm going to be interested to see is Bradlee Anae out of Utah. Now, Bradlee Anae, you look at the game film, his arms don't look to be very long. They look short, to be perfectly honest. And that's one of the things that you worry about is if you have that short reach, those offensive linemen with considerably longer arms, are they going to be able to get into your body and really stifle any type of a run? And the thing with Bradlee Anae that you're not going to see at the combine, that you're not going to see in the stat sheets, is his ability to win with his hands. And that's one of the things, the hand fighting. He's one of the better defensive linemen with the hand fighting. He's able to win with his hands, able to attack the offensive tackle's hands, either with a slap, or he'll even grab their hands and just take them and throw them away as he's bending around the edge. You're going to see some bend from him. Again, 6'3", 265, 29 and a half sacks in his career, including 13 this past season. He's a physical guy. I think you're going to see some power in the drills as well. I think Bradlee Anae is looking to solidify himself as a day 2 pick. As we continue to move along, Marlon Davidson. How athletic is this guy going to be? That's really the big question that I'm going to have for him is he, he's 6'3", 278, and I saw some explosiveness. It was inconsistent. There were times where he just was unblockable coming off the edge. You'd see the speed to power. You'd see him bending around the edge. And the real question was it just the caliber of offensive tackle that he was working against, or is he really that athletic? Just 11 and a half tackles for loss, 6.5 sacks, playing alongside Derek Brown. And I thought he did a decent job setting the edge against the run. He's going to be one that I'm going to be looking at to say, a lot of people are starting to talk about him potentially in the first round. I don't see it. And this is really going to be his time to show everyone just how athletic he is. If he's going to be a first round pick, that's really going to be a huge question mark for me. Yetur Gross-Matos, 6'5", 264 out of Penn State. This guy, I think he's still raw with some of his pass rush ability. This was someone who made a ton of plays in the backfield, had 20 tackles for loss as a sophomore, followed that up with a similar performance, 14 and a half tackles for loss in 2019, 18 and a half sacks in his career. The length is going to be ridiculous with him. But for me, the inconsistency, again, the production, getting home to the quarterback, you didn't always see him. There were times where, I don't know if he was taking plays off. The motor just seemed to be running hot and cold. And I think his pad level at times would creep up. There are some drills that, will really expose some of that, be able to see, can he bend at the waist? Can he stay low firing off the ball? Or is he someone who's going to be popping up out of his stance? If he pops up out of his stance, that's going to give an offensive lineman a much bigger target to attack and get his hands on. So continuing through this list, let's see who else we have here. Kenny Willekes is going to be a guy that I think is going to be intriguing. 6'4", 260 pounds. The former walk-on there at Michigan State. Burlsworth Award winner. He's someone for me, when I watch him play, that he's a guy with tireless effort, always working to the quarterback, but he's limited athletically. 49 tackles for loss, 23 and a half sacks. I used to compare him to Chase Winovich, and I think this year, the lack of athleticism really was exposed. This was someone who I really struggled to get off some blocks, and I worry for him that if he looks stiff in drills, if he doesn't look to be as fluid an athlete as you're needing, I think he may fall to the 4th round. I think he may be a 4th or 5th rounder. And a guy like Chase Young ended up getting drafted in the 3rd round, despite showing tremendous athleticism. So I think Kenny Willekes, he's got a lot to prove for me at the combine. So continuing again with the defensive ends as we're looking through this, Trevin Hill out of Miami. I think he's going to be a workout warrior. He's going to be somebody that you're going to be looking at going, wow, this guy can really, really move. Very explosive athlete. Started his career at Virginia Tech, had the issues there in 2018. Only played 3 games and ultimately got kicked off the team. Ended up getting transferring to Miami, and look, 9.5 tackles for loss, 4.5 sacks. He's got a lot of a lot of questions to answer with the off-field issues. So even though he's going to look tremendous in a lot of the drills, in my opinion, he's a little undersized. He's probably going to be a 34 outside linebacker at 6'3", 238. We'll see if he put on any weight prior to the combine, but the interviews are going to be critical for him. And if he doesn't interview well, he's going to be one of those guys. I look at a guy like Ja'Kai Polite and just, the interviews were a big red flag, and the lack of production in his rookie year, really a huge concern. So you look at a guy like Trevin Hill, is that going to be the same type of player? That's one of those big concerns that you're going to have. Let's see, who else do we have? Jabari Zuniga is somebody who, when you watch the film, he doesn't look all that athletic, but I'm telling you what, he's going to be a guy who I think is going to set the stage on fire. Zuniga, 6'4", 246, played in only 5 games in 2019, hampered by some injuries, but in those 5 games, 5.5 tackles for loss, 3 sacks, a guy who can bend coming around the edge, but really what's intriguing for him is his versatility. He can rush the passer along the interior of the line. He'd line up at the 3 technique and was blowing by guys, splitting double teams, shooting the A gap. That the quickest quickest way to get to the quarterback is a straight line. And if you're shooting through that A gap right off the snap, getting in there, affecting the quarterback, he's somebody who has been one of the more disruptive players. He just needed to stay healthy and stay on the field. But I think Jabari Zuniga is going to be somebody who's going to surprise people, and I think he's going to creep up into day 2, and I think will end up being a productive pro at the next level. So that's Zuniga. His teammate over there, Jonathan Greenard, I think, looked like the more athletic of the two, but I have more concerns with him. I think some of the injury concerns, they're ultimately transferred from Louisville to Florida. 16 tackles for loss and 10 sacks, and he's very athletic, very explosive coming off the edge. Tremendous first step quickness, uses his hands very well, turning the corner. But again, 6'4", 263. I really want to see the bend. I really want to see him as he works through those drills, just how athletic he's going to be, and making sure that those medicals check out okay for him. So continuing through, and there's some other names that are on here. I think Kendall Coleman and Alton Robinson from Syracuse, a couple of guys who were tremendous in 2018, and then they saw their draft, really their production dropped off considerably in 2019. Those are 2 guys who really have to put on a show. They have to really be tremendously athletic, and guys that, really teams, you want to have those coaches in the room saying, this is something that I can work with. Tireless workers, athletes, guys that are going to be able to bend and come off the edge. Kendall Coleman, 6'3", 253, 12.5 tackles for loss and 10 sacks, and basically, his sack output dropped to 4 in 2019, and then Alton Robinson was really looked at as a guy who could potentially be a first rounder. Now he's kind of a fringe second day pick. 6'4", 260 himself, 17 tackles for loss, 10 sacks. Syracuse was one of those surprise teams in 2018. Eric Dungy was the quarterback. Dino Babers, everything was flying high. 2019, really the opposite. Tommy DeVito, the quarterback, really struggled to get things going. And you also saw that on the defensive side. They were on the field a lot more. 9 tackles for loss, 4 sacks. That's going to be the big question is was it just more of a matter of that defense was on the field a lot more than they were in 2018, and did that play a role in any of that production? One guy that I've left out is Julian Okwara out of Notre Dame, the 6'4", 248-pound defensive end. I think he's probably going to be a 3-4 outside linebacker at the next level. A guy who, look, in 2018, 12 and a half tackles for loss, 8 sacks. He was building on that in 2019 before a broken fibula knocked him out for the remainder of the season in early November. I believe that was against Duke. And he's going to showcase, has really long arms, and you're expecting to see a pretty fluid athlete. But because of the broken fibula, he's not going to be doing any of the drills or any, getting timed at all at the combine. So he's really going to have to hopefully be at a place where he'll be able to have one of those individual workouts. But I think Julian Okwara, just because you don't take part in the combine doesn't mean you're not going to be a first rounder. You look at Jeffrey Simmons, he was so dominant at Mississippi State. And yes, he had the off-field issues, but really a model citizen. That's really, everyone came to his defense, and he still ended up getting drafted in the first round and looked good for Tennessee. The difference with Julian Okwara is he did not dominate the game when he was in it. There were times where you'd see him really putting pressure on the quarterback, the QB pressures, really being disruptive, but it was inconsistent. Both he and Khalid Kareem, and Julian Okwara, he's not, he's more athletic than his brother Romeo. I'd say that Khalid Kareem is more of your Romeo Okwara. He's 6'4", 265, and a guy who I think does a good job setting the edge against the run, limited as a pass rusher. I think he's probably going to be a mid-day 3 pick, but a guy who's going to end up making an NFL roster and is going to be a rotational defensive end when it's all said and done. Flipping back to the quote-unquote linebackers of the edge rusher group, there's some names that people aren't talking about. Minnesota's Carter Coughlin, a guy who has a nonstop motor, very tough, hard-nosed guy coming off the edge, 6'4", 245, 22 and a half sacks in his career. But I really worry about his athleticism. Is he going to be another stiff player like Porter Gustin? Tipa Naliai out of Utah State started his career at TCU, moved to Utah State. And this is a guy who, really expecting big things in 2018, 13 and a half tackles for loss and 10 sacks, comes into 2019, just 9 tackles for loss and half the sack output with just 5 sacks. Is Tipa Naliai, I think teams really were recognizing what you had there with the athleticism, and were forcing, taking him away and really one-on-one on the opposite end, and they weren't really getting exposed. The Aggies, really struggled at times to get after the quarterback. So that's really the big question mark that I have is what's the athleticism going to be like? I think he's going to test pretty well. He has really good length, and he's one of those guys that may fly under the radar, be a late day 3 pick, but end up being productive. Anthony Jennings out of Alabama, 6'3", 259. I want to see how this guy tests, because I thought he's one of those guys that just kind of flies under the radar. Extremely productive in 2019, 83 tackles, 12 and a half tackles for loss, 8 sacks, 5 pass breakups, and that's coming off a year, the year prior where we had 11 pass breakups. I think of Uchenna Nwosu and those long arms and his ability to time the jumps and really affect the passer. When you're talking about a guy in 2 seasons having 16 pass breakups, and 18 total for his career, those are guys who understand how to get their hands in a passing lane, understand angles and being able to get their hand up and deflect passes. You're going to have a home at the next level. And I look at Anthony Jennings, whether he's putting his hand in the ground or coming off the edge as an edge rusher, he can get to the quarterback. He can play in space a little bit. He plays well against the run, very active and productive. He may be limited as an athlete, but I'm not expecting him to time, overly, have overly fast times. I don't think he's going to be overly athletic, but he's just somebody who gets home, gets to the quarterback, makes plays on the football, and somebody who, can fall to day 3. But I really would question that. I think he's somebody who should be a day 2 guy when it's all said and done. And I think this is the first step for him to prove that that's where he belongs. Now, I'm going to give you a couple of FCS guys. I'm sorry, not FCS, but group of 5 guys. Alex Highsmith out of Charlotte's one of them. He's 6'4", 242. And look, in 2018, 18 and a half tackles for loss, just 3 sacks. He was really a guy who was all about shooting into the backfield and making plays behind the line. Understood, diagnosing plays, being able to get off blocks and really read defenses. If a line is slanting, he's pulling, coming off of the guard's hip and shooting into the backfield. But then he really was able to put everything together as a pass rusher. 15 sacks in 2019. You went from 3 sacks to 15, and that's 5 times the output. If you're doing the math, 21 and a half total tackles for loss, very explosive. He was just kind of in the All-Star games. Wasn't all that, didn't really make a mark. I think this is an area where he really needs to showcase things if he wants to be a day 2 pick. I think he's going to fall to day 3, but I think he's got a shot. He was very productive, both against the run and the pass. So he's somebody to keep an eye out for, to see just what he's going to be doing there. One other guy that I thought was fun to watch was Ladarius Hamilton out of North Texas, 6'3", 260, back-to-back seasons with 7.5 sacks there for the Mean Green there. And one FCS guy to really keep an eye on is Derek Tuska out of North Dakota State. I thought he looked good in the All-Star games. 6'5", 246, 29 and a half sacks in his career. 42 total tackles for loss. A guy who just has a nonstop motor, keeps working to the quarterback, shows a decent bend. He's someone who I think, you're looking at that 5th round range is probably where he's going to go. But, I like seeing the fact that there's an FCS guy in this crop that, really he's going to force you to keep an eye on him throughout this pre-draft process. So those are some of the edge rushers that I wanted to make sure that I talked about. Before we move on, I left out 2 guys, and I can't believe that I did. Darrell Taylor out of Tennessee, Josh Uche out of Michigan. Now, Josh Uche, he was showing an ability to drop into coverage in the Senior Bowl that you really didn't see there at Michigan. And that's one of the things that I love about the Senior Bowl, that I love about the Combine. A guy like Hassan Reddick out of Temple. This was a guy that was more of an edge guy. And you watched him playing at linebacker, able to drop into coverage, making plays all over the field, both at the Senior Bowl and at the Combine. His draft stock rose and put him right into the 1st round. Josh Uche, I'm not saying that he's going to be a 1st-round pick, but I'm saying that this is going to be a guy who I think is going to solidify his status as a 2nd-round guy, showcasing his ability that, hey, look, I can drop into coverage just as much as I can get after the quarterback. And when you're talking about a guy who's 6'2", 250, likely going to be an outside linebacker in a 34, 15 and a half sacks, including, 14 and a half in the last 2 seasons. Uche is one of those guys to really keep an eye out for. And the other guy, as I mentioned, Darrell Taylor, one of the more athletic guys. People talk about him not having a ton of bend, but I would disagree with that. You watch him as he's turning the corner. He can turn the corner in a hurry. He can flip those hips and flatten out to the quarterback before the offensive lineman really knows what hit him. At least 8 sacks in each of the last 2 seasons, 19 and a half for his career. This is a guy, 6'4", 255, who is very explosive coming off the edge. And he's one of those guys who can affect the game. Is he going to be a day 2 pick? I think he'll be one of those question mark 3rd, 4th round range, but he's so explosive that he's going to force you to take notice as well. And I think that's one of the things that you're going to be seeing at the Combine. So we transition from the edge rushers to the defensive tackles. And so if you're talking about, as we were talking about earlier, about defensive tackles at, in 2019, we had 23 total defensive tackles drafted. 19 of those were invited to the Combine. And so you had 24 defensive tackles at the Combine, and 5 of those defensive tackles were not drafted. So the defensive tackles that weren't drafted, Albert Huggins of Clemson and Jonathan Ledbetter of Georgia, were 2 of those. Those were guys that were basically situational players. They were more rotational guys, and so they weren't seen as guys that you would bring in as draftable prospects, or guys that you bring in to potentially fill out a roster as an undrafted free agent. Daniel Wise, very productive at Kansas, ran a 5.28 40 at 6'3", 281. That's just not going to cut it. Gerald Willis out of Miami, very explosive. This was a guy who had his second chance there at Miami. So some of the off-field issues could have been a concern there. Also didn't get to perform at the combine, so that didn't really help either. Kevin Givens, you're expecting more out of a guy 6'1", 285 to be more explosive, ran a 5.08 40. And then let's see. I've covered my five. So those are the five defensive tackles who were not drafted that were actually at the combine. And Jeffrey Simmons, as I mentioned, didn't get the invite because of his off-field issues. The other three were seventh-round picks. P.J. Johnson, the mammoth guy in the middle there for Arizona, he battled some injury concerns himself. Michael Dogba of Temple, drafted by the Cardinals with the number 249 overall, an athletic defensive tackle, not really on a lot of people's radars, but I think as the pre-draft process continued, you saw a guy who with some pretty good athleticism. And then Cortez Broughton out of Cincinnati going to the Chargers, number 242 overall. I really was a big fan of Cortez Broughton, a guy who could both rush the passer and make plays behind the line of scrimmage, affecting run plays. And, ultimately he got drafted by the Chargers. So it's not the end all be all when you're looking at the defensive tackle position that if you're not invited to the combine, you won't make it. But, you've got to be one of those guys that's going to set yourself apart a little bit. And, if you're talking about this year's draft class at the defensive tackle position, obviously you got to start the conversation with Derrick Brown. Derrick Brown, to me, he's just a beast. He has exceptional explosiveness, such power in his hands, really does a great job getting the offensive lineman off balance with his hands. He can shoot double teams. He affects both the pass and the run. A guy who, look, in his last 3 seasons had over 150 tackles as well, from the defensive tackle position. He's 6'5", 318, pretty good length, 33 tackles for loss, also 12 and a half sacks. So, in 8 pass breakups, 5 forced fumbles, 4 fumble recoveries, a guy who just always seemed to be winning there at the point of attack. And a guy that you really couldn't block, just facing him, just man up. A lot of times you had to sit there and have a guard chip on him or potentially put a running back in the backfield to try to help out. But a guy who was just like a Mack truck running people over. He's going to be a lot of fun to watch, and you're going to see kind of a dancing bear with all of that athleticism. But beyond him, the other freakish athlete is Javon Kinlaw out of South Carolina, 6'6", 310. If you watched him at the combine, he was virtually unblockable. You saw the speed off the ball, the quickness, the speed to power to drive guys back into the backfield. And one of the things, he just continued to work and just, over all of those guards at the Senior Bowl. One of those guys was John Simpson, and I went back and read my notes of the South Carolina Clemson game, and that's what he was doing in that game as well. He did a really good job of getting under Simpson's pad level and would drive him into the backfield, and that would disrupt a lot of the run plays. He'd take away cutback lanes. He would drive guards into running backs and really blow up that run play altogether. So there were times where he wouldn't even make the play in the backfield, but he was the one, really he made the play. He didn't actually get the tackle for loss or really get the drop on the ball carrier, but he was the one that affected the play overall. 17 tackles for loss, 10 sacks in his career, excellent length. Those are your 2 surefire first-round picks. And I think after that, you're going to be looking at some guys who are really, there's going to be that next tier. And there's some room there for some of these guys. And I think like Ross Blacklock out of TCU, 6'4", 305, the junior, 15 and a half tackles for loss, 5.5 sacks in his career. But what you really saw from Blacklock was the twitchiness. This was a guy, the athleticism to move laterally. You'd see him move and come around and bend. You don't see defensive tackles who weigh 305 that are coming around, dipping their shoulder underneath the guard or the center and able to turn the corner the way that he was able to do. And it wasn't just about the power. That's really the bigger question that I'm going to have for Ross Blacklock is, where's the power there? He's definitely an athlete, but if he can show that he's also has some power, especially when you're watching him in the bench press and things like that, when you're talking bench press, able to take a guy and extend your arms and really create some separation and then disengage from that block, that's really what you're looking for. You don't want to have a guy that's going to get into your body, get an offensive tackle or an offensive guard or a center into your body as a defensive lineman. Can you get into them first, bench press them, shove them back, create some separation, and then use your hands to get off that block and make a play on the ball? Neville Gallimore out of Oklahoma, 6'2", 302, very stout at the point of attack. But the first step quickness, this was a guy, if you look at the stats, you're like, wow, he just had 29 tackles in 2019, 17 tackles for loss, 8.5 sacks. But this was a guy who was very explosive. He was somebody who was, with that first step quickness, was shooting gaps and getting into the backfield and affecting quarterbacks. If you're moving the quarterback off their mark, you're making him uncomfortable, you're making him more susceptible to making those bad throws. I think Neville Gallimore is another one of those guys that, with a combine performance, could potentially sneak his way into round number 1, but I think he'll probably be an early day 2 guy. Jordan Elliott out of Missouri, the Texas transfer, went to the Missouri Tigers, and everyone remembers him for his 3-sack game as a sophomore. A guy. Again, you can't just look at the stats. This is a guy who is going to win at the point of attack. He's 6'4", 315, pretty explosive. And that's, when you watch the defensive linemen, you want to see just how explosive some of these guys are going to be. Raekwon Davis out of Alabama, 6'7", 312, excellent length. But this was a guy, to me, there was so much potential with Raekwon Davis. And I think the biggest thing was in 2017, 8.5 sacks, had that interception return, and everyone was just enamored with Raekwon Davis. Since then, these last 2 seasons, you haven't seen the production. And that's very, very concerning if you're going to be talking about a guy in round number 1 or really, day 2. I think Raekwon Davis is really going to have to showcase, answer a lot of questions. Why the significant drop off? Just 8.5 tackles for loss and 2 sacks in 2 seasons after a tremendous 2017. He's going to have to answer those questions. And, he's also going to have to have a tremendous combine performance if he wants to really rebound from that. I think a team is probably going to take him in round 2, late round 2 or early round 3 because of the potential. But for me, I wasn't all that impressed. And it's one of those things to where, because of his athleticism, because of his size, you really are left wanting more. Transitioning from some of the athletic guys to a guy who's just is going to maul you and try to beat you up in the middle. That's Leki Fotu out of Utah, 6'5", 335. He's hasn't finished a season healthy there with Utah. He played in just 9 games in 2019, played in 10 games in each of the 2 previous seasons, but he's one of those guys who's going to be stout at the point of attack. Think Star Lotulelei, but not quite as athletic. He's a lot bigger than Star was. But a guy who can get physical at the point of attack, has some short area quickness. When you're talking about some phone booth quickness, I think Fotu has some of that. And the question is just how often is he going to be making plays in the backfield against the quarterback? And that really is going to depend. That's going to depend his draft stock. I think he'll probably end up being a 3rd rounder, but one of those guys. I think you want to see some of that power, and just how quick is he? How quick is he going to be coming off the football? That's one of the things that you're going to be seeing there at the combine. Let's see. Devon Hamilton, I'm looking forward to seeing him there out of Ohio State, a guy who was kind of a rotational player there at the defensive line position for the Buckeyes. But I think, I really want to see his athleticism. Justin Matabuke for Texas A&M, the junior, they're at defensive tackle, power in his hands, a guy, again, really good at bench pressing his man and driving him back. But you want to see some of that explosiveness. So that's something that I'm really going to be looking for and waiting for from him. Rashad Lawrence out of LSU, 6'2", 308, not the most athletic guy, but a guy who just seemed to, he's a guy that you want on your squad. But the question is, because he is 6'2", is he going to be a 5 technique? Is he going to be a 3 technique? That's something that a lot of teams are going to have to answer. I just realized that I left out an edge rusher who's one of my favorite players in this draft, and I'd be remiss if I didn't cover him And that's James Lynch out of Baylor. I can't believe I missed this guy. I think he's going to be someone that teams are going to be really wanting to go back to the game film and watch more of, because I think he's got better bend for a guy 6'4", 295 than he gets credit for. He's a junior, and 33 tackles for loss, 20 sacks in his career, 13 and a half this past season. And when you watch him play, also 5 pass breakups, 3 forced fumbles in 2019. But when you watch him play, he has a decent first step quickness, but then you watch him as he's turning the corner. He's able to dip and get underneath that offensive tackle's pad level and turn that corner. And when he's turning the corner, he doesn't have those extra steps as he's coming around that edge. He's able to get a nice tight turn, and he's coming around that edge, flatten out to the quarterback, and put some pressure on quarterbacks. Big 12 offenses were seeing this guy in their sleep. He was somebody who was always putting pressure on the quarterback. He and Bravion Roy were a dynamic pair for the Baylor Bears. I think James Lynch is going to be somebody who's going to continue to rise up draft boards and probably end up being a second-round pick when it's all said and done. So sorry to kind of backtrack just a little bit there, but he was one of those guys that I have to make sure before the podcast was up that I had to talk about. Now, James Strobridge out of North Carolina, 6'5", 285. If you look at the stat sheets, you're like, 22 tackles for loss, 10 and a half sacks there at the defensive tackle position. But this is a guy, I think he has some versatility. He can be either a 3 technique or a 5 technique in a 3-4. And the athleticism really jumped off the film as I was watching the Senior Bowl. He was somebody who was winning the one-on-ones, and somebody who I think, because of his athleticism, because of what he did at the Senior Bowl, if he can follow that up, I think he's going to be somebody that teams will be talking about there early day 3. Robert Windsor out of Penn State, 6'4", 285, 19 tackles for loss, 13 sacks. Look, he's the more athletic version of Kevin Givens. He's a lot taller as well, but kind of an undersized. In terms of their weight, he's just 285. Robert Windsor, though, has some athleticism, has some quickness coming off the football. I want to see what he runs that 40 time. If ultimately he can do pretty well there, I think he's going to be one of those guys who's going to continue to move up draft boards. And you can hear my Silver Lab Figaro. She's in the room with me as I'm conducting this podcast. She's snoring, and okay, she's okay now. Let's see. Raekwon Williams is the other guy that you want to keep an eye out for. 6'4", 303 out of Michigan State. At times was virtually unblockable, and that's only if he kept his pad level low. You want to see, can he stay low at the combine during those drills? That's going to be a big question mark for me as to whether or not he's going to be somebody who's going to be drafted early. My guess is probably 5th, 6th round right now is kind of where I can see him going. So we transition to the linebacker position. So we're talking true linebackers and not the edge rushers at the linebacker position. And when we're talking linebackers, let's see. There are 37 linebackers at the combine. 16 were not drafted. So 36 total linebackers that were drafted. If you include the edge rushers, if you take them out, then you're talking about 25 total drafted and 4 that weren't invited to the combine. So when we take a look at, first of all, the 4 that weren't invited to the combine that were drafted, you're talking Quincy Williams going to the Jags in round number 3. Let's see, Cole Holcomb for North Carolina went to the Redskins there in the 5th round. You saw some athleticism from him. He put out some really fast 40 times at his workout, and I think that's one of the things that really helped get him a spot on a roster. Ulysses Gilbert III, one of my favorite players. If you listen to the 2019 podcast series, I loved him coming out of Akron. A guy who can play in space, tackle machine, can cover a lot of different players. An undersized linebacker, but he was taken in the 6th round by the Steelers. And then you had Caden Ellis out of Idaho, veteran guy, a guy who was really a special teams ace. He went to the Saints in round number 7, got a little bit of playing time there for New Orleans as well. So those were the 4 that weren't invited. Some pretty good athletes. And when you're talking about the combine, if you're looking at the linebacker position a season ago, some of the guys that weren't drafted that still ended up making an impact, Azeez Al-Shire, his biggest thing was the knee injury. He was very productive there for Florida Atlantic, but he just, the knee injury was a huge concern, and that really, was something that teams had a red flag, and wanted to find a little bit more of. Jeff Allison from Fresno State, 5'11", 228, ran a 4'8", 240. Just, one of your slower linebackers, Bryson Allen Williams, a 4'8", 840. Tevin Coney, you're expecting more athleticism from him. He was a guy that, he needed to show an ability to play sideline to sideline, more of a one direction type of guy. TJ Edwards ran a 4'8", 740 at his pro day for Wisconsin, and that was a huge concern. This was a volume tackler, but when you've got, you're not putting out the type of speed that you're expecting at the linebacker position, that's going to affect your draft stock overall. One of the bigger surprises was Terrell Hanks. He ran a 4.98 40 at the combine. This is a guy who ended up making a roster there with the Dolphins, got some playing time, but that 40 time really had teams concerned. And so that really affected his draft stock as well. Kendall Joseph ran a 5.05 40. Trey Lamar, 4.91 40. So when you're looking at some of these things and you're looking at some of the 40 times, you're talking about guys who could be fringe players, probably day 3 guys, and you're watching the game film, you're looking at guys saying, well, these guys may not be overly athletic. I want to see what they can do when we get out there. What type of 40 are they going to run? And they really disappointed. There were guys that you looked at and you're like, well, it's really what I saw out there on the game film. A guy like Cameron Smith out of USC going to Minnesota ran a 4.69 40, 39-inch vertical leap, much better athlete than you were expecting. And that, I think, sent people back to game film as well for a guy like that. So when you're looking at the linebacker position, you have to have athletes. You have to have guys that are able to run. Can they move in space, or not? And if you're one of those slower linebackers, that's really going to be trouble for you. And, like a guy like Evan Weaver, a volume tackler. This is a guy who, when you talk Evan Weaver, there wasn't a ball carrier he couldn't run down. I mean, the instincts, his angles to the football, 6'3", 235. I mean, over 400 tackles in his career, 181 this past season. And a guy who showed that he can drop back into coverage just a little bit, had 2 interceptions, one that he took back for a touchdown in 2018, 6 pass breakups in 2018 as well. And the question that everyone's going to have is, how big of a liability is he going to be in coverage? You want to see just how stiff the hips are going to be in some of the drills. How fast is he going to run? If he's going to be running in that 4.8, 4.9 range, then that's going to be somebody that, could be a late day 3 pick, possibly not even get himself drafted. But, here's a guy who has tremendous instincts. You can't just rely on what the combine's going to be. But it's going to be a huge concern if you're not able to produce, some quality numbers as well. So that's going to be a big question mark for me when I look at the linebacker position. Obviously, when you talk linebackers, the first and foremost is going to be Isaiah Simmons out of Clemson, 6'4", 230 pounds. The junior, look, this guy's not getting out of the top 10. Could the Giants take him? Could the Lions take him at number 3? Absolutely. The Giants could always use another athlete there on the defensive side of the football. I actually have him penciled in going to Carolina. And I think Carolina needs a guy in the middle that's going to take the place of Luke Kuechly, and I think Isaiah Simmons is going to be that guy. If he's not drafted by Carolina, he's not falling past Jacksonville, because Jacksonville needs a guy to take the place of the retired Telvin Smith, and I think Isaiah Simmons is going to be that guy. He can line up all over the field. He can be an edge rusher. He can be a guy that's going to drop back in space as a linebacker. He can line up over the slot, cover tight ends, cover running backs, be a deep safety over the top. Does a little bit of everything. I mean, 28.5 tackles for loss, 11 sacks, including 8 this past season, 4 interceptions, 3 of those this past season as well, 20 pass breakups, 6 forced fumbles. This guy was all over the field. I'll never forget, and I talked about it earlier in one of the other podcasts, against South Carolina, he's covering Shi Smith, a slot receiver, pretty quick slot receiver, and he's beaten initially, shows some tremendous recovery speed, tracking the ball over his shoulder, able to elevate, time his jump well, and knock the pass away. Just tremendous athleticism there at the linebacker position. Can play over the top as well. Does a really good job reading the quarterback's eyes. He's a converted safety, so he's the next in line in terms of those linebackers, that new age linebacker for this ever changing game. He's the guy that people are going to be looking for, and I think top 5 is not out of the question for a guy like that. I think he's going to put on a show and just be a tremendous workout warrior. But there's more to it than just that. Another guy who's going to really show up well, I think, is going to be Kenneth Murray out of Oklahoma. If you watched any of the Sooners games, this is a guy sideline to sideline, just very athletic, explosive speed. When he is allowed to just pin his ears back and go after the football, there are a few guys that can chase down a ball carrier like Kenneth Murray. The problem is the gap integrity. That's really the biggest concern that I have. You put him on the inside and you're telling him to, play against the run, and he seemed to he was missing gaps. He had his assignments, wasn't doing a really good job reading his keys, and he'd over pursue holes. He was hitting the wrong hole a lot of times, and when he was allowed to really play in space, once Caleb Kelly came back and took over the middle linebacker position for OU, you allowed him to move outside and just allowed him to run freely. And that's really where I think Kenneth Murray is going to excel at the next level. Kenneth Murray, when you look at him, you're talking about his numbers back to back 100 tackle seasons, had 155 in 2018. A lot of that was the 30+ tackle performance against Army. But 36 and a half tackles for loss, can get after the quarterback a little bit. Had at least 4 sacks in each of the last 2 seasons. To me, Kenneth Murray is one of those fringe first-round players. Teams may fall in love with him because of the athleticism, but there are some question marks, as to where you're going to play him on the inside or outside. So, but I think he's going to be one of those guys that's going to have a tremendous workout. One of the guys who's flying under the radar is Logan Wilson out of Wyoming, and I want to see him as I think he's going to move himself into day 2 consideration. I think of Jelani Tavai, some of these other guys that teams weren't really expecting to see. A lot of people talking about the draft weren't expecting to see Jelani Tavai shoot into the second round. But look at the production that Logan Wilson had for Wyoming, over 400 tackles. Just fell. Let's see. 6 tackles in 2016 and 1 tackle in 2018, shy of 4 straight seasons with over 100 tackles. 34 and a half tackles for loss, 7 sacks, 10 interceptions, including 4 this past season, 14 pass breakups, 5 forced fumbles, 4 fumble recoveries, and a partridge in a pear tree. This is a guy looking for the football, just a playmaker flying all over the field, 6'2", 250. What type of athlete is this guy going to be? I think he's going to be somebody, you see the instincts, you see him being able to drop into coverage. You saw it at the Senior Bowl, able to drop into space, drop into passing lanes, read the quarterback's eyes, elevate and make a play. I think he's going to be one of those athletes that's after the combine, teams are going to be looking at him going, wow, we need to get this guy on our roster. And I expect him to rise up draft boards very quickly. Another one of my favorite linebackers is Malik Harrison out of Ohio State, 6'3", 240. A lot of people say, he may not be the best athlete in the bunch, but look, he just gets the job done. 75 tackles, 16 and a half tackles for loss, 3.5 sacks in 2019. A guy who I thought played well laterally, very instinctive. He was one of those guys who knew where the football was going to be going. A guy who can make plays, not only behind the line of scrimmage, but can drop into coverage a little bit. That's really where I think Malik Harrison is going to have to showcase his skills, is when he, in his drops. How stiff in those hips is he going to be? Can he showcase, an ability to move laterally and really, backpedal? Is he going to be somebody that you can trust, covering tight ends and running backs? Or is he going to be more of a zone defender? And that's going to be one of those questions, that's ultimately going to impact his draft stock. Troy Dye, I want to see what type of athlete Troy Dye is. This is somebody who, 391 tackles, 41 and a half inch, 41 and a half tackles for loss, 13 sacks, 5 interceptions, 14 pass breakups. Another guy putting up tremendous numbers. Everyone's talking about him as one of those top end linebackers, and I want to see both him and I'll give you another name, Jordan Brooks out of Texas Tech. Another guy, we're not really talking about Jordan Brooks. He spells his first name Jordyn, but when I was looking at the NFL website, they had Dan. Not really getting a lot of love is Jordan Brooks, but 360 tackles, 32 tackles for loss, 6.5 sacks in his career. A guy who I think does a really good job, volume tackler, a guy who shoots holes, shoots gaps, makes plays behind the line of scrimmage against the run. Not as much of a pass guy, in terms of putting pressure on the quarterback, but a guy who is very instinctive, and diagnoses the run quickly and then makes plays. Does a really good job getting off blocks, and I want to see from an athleticism standpoint where he ends up falling. Francis Bernard out of Utah, 6'1", 235. I think he has to have a big combine. This is a guy who at Utah this past season, 85 tackles, 7.5 tackles for loss, played pretty well in space, but I question whether or not he's going to be the athlete everyone is expecting him to be. One guy who I think is a tremendous athlete, the numbers don't really show it, showcase some of the production, but Sean Bradley out of Temple, 6'1", 230. I expect him to have a good combine. In terms of the stats, that's going to be a guy that I think is going to turn heads. One guy that I feel really bad for is Marcus Bailey out of Purdue, 6'1", 240. He had played in just 2 games, before he went down to a season-ending injury. Still ended up with over 300 tackles in his career, 28 tackles for loss, 14 and a half sacks, 6 interceptions, another 6 pass breakups, and a guy who I think was expected to lead that Purdue defense, and Purdue looking to really try to build upon their season in 2018. And when you lose the leader of your defense, Jeff Brom defensively, really had his work cut out for him. And Marcus Bailey, I worry about him from the standpoint of where is he going to be at health wise? Is he going to be somebody who goes undrafted? I look at a guy like Juwan Bentley, who also came out of Purdue, very productive, and I think Marcus Bailey can be that same type of player there at the next level. He's injured, so I don't anticipate him to participate in any of the drills, but I think he's going to impress in the interviews. Speaking of interviews, a guy who's going to have to answer for himself is Joe Bacci, 6'2", 231 out of Michigan State. A guy who made plays all over the field for the Spartans, was one of the defensive leaders, back-to-back 100 tackle seasons in 2017 and 2018. Played in just 8 games this season, and it was due in large part to his suspension for PED usage. So he's going to have to answer some questions there from the interview perspective, and that's going to be something. He's going to have to also showcase his ability to drop into coverage, and I think a lot of teams are worried that is he going to be stiff? The stiffness is going to be a huge concern, I think, for him. Staying in the Big Ten, I look at a guy like Cameron Brown out of Penn State, 6'5", 233 pounds. Not really a guy known for his production, but a guy who ends up making plays all over the field for Penn State. I think he's going to put on a nice combine, but I think if you're looking for a guy who's going to be sneaky good at the combine and is going to probably put challenge Isaiah Simmons, it's going to be Akeem Davis-Gaither out of Appalachian State, 6'2", 216 pounds, kind of an undersized linebacker. Want to see what he weighs in at. If he's going to be weighing in that 225, 230 range, I think teams are really going to start taking notice. I think he'll solidify himself as a day 2 pick. In really 2 seasons with the Mountaineers, over just under 200 tackles, 24 tackles for loss, 6.5 sacks, 15 pass breakups, tremendous length, the range. He's like another safety out there, but a guy who tremendous lateral quickness against the run, a guy who can drop into coverage. another one of those new age linebackers. And I think if he has a tremendous combine performance, we're going to be looking at Akeem Davis-Gaither as a day 2 pick. So those are the linebackers that I'm really interested in keeping an eye on. There's some other guys, Kamal Martin out of Minnesota, tremendous athlete. When you think about Minnesota linebackers, Devondre Campbell was a guy that showed off some pretty good athleticism at the combine. I think Kamal Martin, 6'3", 245, played in just 8 games, was battling some injuries. I hope he's going to be healthy enough to compete, because I think he can showcase some of his athleticism. I want to see just how athletic Jordan Mack is of Virginia, 6'2", 230, a guy who had 7.5 sacks this past season, but I think he was virtually a non-factor dropping into coverage. We were 2 years removed from a guy who was 114 tackles there for UVA. I want to see what type of athlete he is, though. Dante Olson out of Montana, 6'3", 240, 397 tackles in his career. What type of athlete are we talking about here at the FCS level? Is this a guy who was just playing against inferior competition? Or is this somebody who can really translate to the next level? I think he'll be a day 3 guy. I think he's going to get himself drafted. I think he's a better athlete than people are going to get him credit for. Really looking forward to seeing what he does at the combine. Jacob Phillips out of LSU. He and Patrick Queen are going to be 2 guys that people are going to be keeping their eye on. Every time I turned on the LSU tape, it seemed like Patrick Queen was flashing. He makes a lot of flash plays. I'm going to be curious to see, how they run. I think, Jacob Phillips, 113 tackles, led the Tigers this past season. His lateral quickness is something that I really see, but I think Queen, with his ability to make plays sideline to sideline, he's going to be an intriguing prospect. He's not a first round pick, though. Let's get that straight. He'll probably end up being a day 2 guy, but I'm thinking late 2nd or early 3rd. And then Shaq Quarterman out of Miami, 4-year starter, started every single game in his Miami career, 52 games in all. This is he was a mainstay there for Miami, 6'1", 241, over 350 tackles in his career, 46.5 tackles for loss, 13 pass breakups. How stiff are those hips? Can he drop into coverage? This is a guy, to me, when I watched him play, he reminded me a lot of Denzel Perryman as a downhill thumper, but he makes some plays dropping into coverage as well, reading the quarterback's eyes. If he can show that he is more athletic than people are giving him credit for, then I think he's going to see his draft stock rise. He'll probably still end up being probably about a 5th round pick, but at the end of the day, he's one of those guys who I think is going to make an NFL roster and be productive at the next level. So we transition from the linebackers to the back end of the defense, and we're going to really be talking about our corners and our safeties. And really, when you're talking about the cornerback position, if we look at last year's draft, we had 36 corners invited to the combine. 11 of them were not drafted. We had 31 total corners drafted, and 25 of those were invited to the combine. So when we look at those numbers and we're scrolling through this, the guys that weren't invited to the combine, Kadar Hallman actually got some playing time there with the Packers, coming out of Toledo. You had Tim Harris from Virginia, Duke Shelley out of K-State, and these guys were all day 3 guys, but guys that teams really kept an eye on. Donnie Lewis was productive at Tulane, going to the Browns in the 7th round. Jimmy Moreland, was one of my favorite players coming out of James Madison. Really, made an impact there for the Redskins. And Stephen Denmark out of Valdosta State. So when you're talking corners, there are going to be some guys that are going to sneak in at the end of the draft. Teams really, they've done some of their scouting, some of their homework, and guys that you're really going to be targeting. I think when you look at the combine itself, and you're looking at some of the guys that did not get drafted, I think some of them are obvious. Derek Beatty, the 6'2", 197, pounder out of Kentucky. You worried about some of his, his long speed. Mark Fields out of Clemson, 5'10", 192, looked decent in some of the drills, 4.37 40, but, a guy who just, he was not even a starter, there at Clemson. And so there are concerns there. Blaise Brown out of Troy looked like a draftable prospect for the Trojans, ran a 4.75 40. That was really a killer for him. Hamp Cheevers, just a 5'9", a buck 69 out of BC, just ran a 4.52. When you're that small, that's going to be a concern. Elijah Holder battled injuries at Stanford, ran a 4.6 40 at 6'1". Ultimately, didn't really work out for him. Ryan Pulley and Jamal Peters, two guys playing in the SEC at Arkansas and Mississippi State, both ran in the 4.6 range. Ryan Pulley, just 11 reps at 225. He was somebody who I think battled some injuries as well. He ended up not getting drafted. You had a guy like, Derek Thomas ran a 4.44 40, 6'3 corner, and he ended up not getting drafted. And a big reason for that, I think, is there was some stiffness in some of those drills, and that really is going to be a concern, especially at the corner position. Could we transition him to safety? It's a possibility, but are you going to use that to draft, one of your draft picks on a guy who really you're looking at more than anything else as a developmental guy? Maybe not. So the corners, how many corners do we have? We have a pretty big draft class. We have 35 corners that are going to be at the combine, and obviously the number one corner on everybody's board is going to be Jeffrey Okudah out of Ohio State. 6'1", 200, the junior. The ball skills are absolutely evident. 17 pass breakups in the last 2 seasons. You watch him, there's not much separation with the receivers. They just struggle getting any separation off of this guy. He's so fluid with his hips, very patient. It's one of those guys, and I think you'll hear that with a lot of these top-notch cover corners, is he's very patient. He stays square to his man and allows his man to ultimately make the first move. And he's so fluid with his hips. He uses the sideline to his advantage as well. He'll pin that guy to the sideline, force a perfect pass to get it in there. And the ball skills absolutely evident. Does a great job attacking the ball at the catch point. Okudah, I have him going to the Lions at number 3. I think, that's definitely a major possibility. So there's a lot of debate now over who the number 2 corner is going to be. A lot of people say that it's CJ Henderson out of Florida. Some people say that it's Christian Fulton out of LSU. What about Trevin Diggs out of Alabama? I'm going to give you a name of a guy who may end up being that number 2 corner, and that's Cam Dantzler out of Mississippi State. 6'2", 185. The junior, you really want to see him, compare him to some of these other cornerbacks and just how fluid of an athlete he is for a guy his size. 20 pass breakups, five interceptions, has tremendous ball skills, but it's the technique and it's the the ability to stay low, in his back pedal, despite the fact that he's 6'2", very fluid with his hips. His position coach at Mississippi State, Terrell Buckley, former NFL star, and T-Buck knows a thing or two about corners. And when he's saying that Cam Dantzler is the best cornerback in this draft class, that, at least if nothing else, has to make you take notice and really go to the game film and watch for yourself. I think CJ Henderson, the big knock for him is going to be the tackling. I think he's going to have to really show out well in some of those interviews. Why is he not much of a tackler? But the ball skills absolutely evident. A guy who was a tremendous cover corner, a lockdown guy out on the edge. You can play him out on an island. And look, Deion Sanders didn't like to tackle, but he was one of the elite corners. And I'm not comparing C.J. Henderson to Deion in that way. But what I am saying is that you don't necessarily need your lockdown corner to be a tremendous tackler. 6'1", 202, the junior. I think he ends up sneaking his way into round number 1. Trevon Diggs, started his career at Alabama as a wide receiver, moved to the defensive back position, and really at the corner, tremendous athleticism for a guy his size. He's continuing to learn the position, and if you look at his productivity, it just keeps getting better and better. 4 interceptions, 3 of which were in 2019, 17 total pass breakups. He's one of those corners who understands the routes, understands a lot of the route concepts, and sometimes runs the route better than the wide receiver. And so I think he's one of those guys. I actually have him penciled in going to the Raiders in round number 1. I think the athleticism, and for a guy his size, I think both he and Cam Dantzler are going to be guys that Mike Mayock and John Gruden are going to be looking at because they need some cornerback help. Christian Fulton out of LSU, 6 foot 200. Another guy who is physical and a guy who has pretty decent hips. If you watch the game against Clemson, he did really open things up and had outside leverage, and T. Higgins was able to get a couple of passes caught on him, really to the inside. But then after that, he locked down T. Higgins. Really couldn't create any separation and stayed on his hip, stayed on that outside hip, and was able to really just provide some blanket coverage. To me, Christian Fulton is a guy who's going to be battling the likes of Jeff Gladney, 6 foot 183 out of TCU, tremendous athlete. I think he's going to be one of those guys that's going to turn heads at the combine with his athleticism. 2 straight years with double-digit pass breakups, 5 interceptions in his career as well. He's an explosive athlete. And, if you watch game film last year of him against Hakeem Butler, I have it penciled in on some of my notes. Hakeem Butler running square ends, and this is a guy who was very patient, kind of waiting for him almost as Butler ate up the cushion and then put his foot in the ground and cut inside. He got right on that hip, no wasted movement. The change of direction was flawless, and there was nowhere for Brock Purdy to go with the football. So I think Jeff Gladney is somebody who you could definitely be talking about as a first rounder as well. Very athletic. Damon Arnett is another very physical corner. I'm glad that he came back for his senior season. I think it definitely improved his draft stock. One of the more physical corners. A guy, look, if you turn on the Michigan State film, Cody White is still going to be seeing Damon Arnett in his nightmares because Arnett just locked him down. White couldn't get any separation. I think Damon Arnett's going to be a day 2 pick, and you're going to get a veteran corner who can offer some upside. And if you're talking about physicality there, then Troy Pride is more of your speedster. I think he may be the fastest of the corners in this year's draft. 5'11", 194, and teams just didn't throw his way. You wanted to pick on some of the other corners because Troy Pride Jr., because of his speed, the makeup ability, receivers oftentimes looked open because there were times where he would get beaten off the line, and the recovery speed was tremendous with him. I think some of the route recognition at times, is lacking, but a guy with speed like that, he's able to make up for that quite a bit. A group of 5 guy to be on the lookout for is Amik Robertson, 5'9", 183. And this guy, you want to talk about some ball skills. 14 interceptions, 3 of which were returned for touchdown, 34 pass breakups in his career. He's undersized. He's a guy that you're probably going to play in the slot, but a tremendous athlete, a tremendous, ball skills, and, somebody who, he's a junior. I think, he didn't really have anything else to prove coming back to Ruston, Louisiana. So I think he's going to be somebody to keep an eye on, as teams are looking for those slot corners. Another slot corner who I think is going to show out pretty well is going to be Kendall Vildor out of Georgia Southern, 5'11", 190. A guy who I think is probably not big enough to play on the outside, but you put him in the slot, I think he has a chance to excel. 9 interceptions, 25 pass breakups in his career. Again, excellent ball skills. A.J. Terrell out of Clemson, 6'1", 190. Is he as good as Trayvon Mullen? Trayvon Mullen, if you'll recall, was a day 2 pick of the Raiders a season ago. He's somebody, to me, was kind of up and down. I thought he got torched time and time again there against LSU there. So he's got a lot of good tape. where he showcases some good ball skills, uses his length to his advantage, and I thought there was some pretty poor tape as well, getting beat left and right. So he's going to have to answer some of those questions. Jalen Johnson, 6', 195 out of Utah, 21 pass breakups in just 3 seasons there with the Utes. My biggest concern for him, you put on a game film like USC going against Michael Pittman Jr., and he wasn't the only one. Michael Pittman Jr. was torching everybody. It didn't matter if your name was Terrell Burgess, Julian Blackmon, or Jalen Johnson. He was torching everybody in that game. Just a tremendous performance. But I thought Jalen Johnson got exposed. You saw him grabbing whenever he could. And when corners panic, they like to grab. And that's the big issue that I have with him. Dane Jackson out of Pittsburgh, 6', 190. He's going to be a day 3 pick, but a guy who is just tremendously productive, excellent ball skills. Back-to-back seasons with double-digit pass breakups, 39 in his career. I want to see just how athletic he is. I worry about some of the stiffness with him, but I think he's somebody who, 4th round pick, and you're going to get a guy who I think is going to end up starting at the next level. Maybe not year 1, but give him, year 2, year 3. I think Dane Jackson's going to be a starter in the league. Noah Igbenogany out of Auburn, the junior, 5'11", 200. Kind of surprised that he came out. He's a tremendous athlete, has 18 pass breakups. Utilizes that quickness and the speed, but I think he still has some things to work on. I think some of the technique needs to work on there as well. But as a kick returner, look, 27.3 yards per return. Actually averaged over 35 yards per return in 2019. 2 kickoff returns for touchdown in his career. Tremendous athlete. Some people have him penciled in as a first rounder. Let's not get carried away. I think he'll be a second round pick because of his athleticism. But I think there's some other corners in here that have better technique than him. So, it'll be interesting. I think someone's going to fall in love with the athleticism, though. Darnay Holmes is another athletic guy, 5'10", 199 out of UCLA, the junior. Showed that he could play on the outside a little bit. I think his home ultimately, though, is going to be in the slot. Lavert Hill, very handsy corner, a guy who I think gets overpowered quite a bit. I thought, he really got pushed around at the Senior Bowl by some of the bigger wide receivers. That's going to be concerning. He's going to have to try to answer that. Harrison Hand out of Temple. I wanted to see him come back for one more year. He was a transfer from Baylor and at Temple showed some ability to be a cover corner. Is he a safety? Is he a corner? We'll see with some of the stiffness in his hips. And then there's Bryce Hall. Bryce Hall played in 6 games in 2019, went down with the torn ACL, probably not going to be able to do anything at the combine, but 38 pass breakups, including 21 in 2018. When you're talking about ball skills, this guy has it for days. In my opinion, he would have been the first corner taken in last year's draft. So, this year we have better corner draft stock, but it's one of those things where I look at and I scratch my head. That Bryce Hill, all he's done is showcase his ball skills, and people continue to drop him down their draft board, and it blows my mind. One name to keep an eye out for in Big 12 plays is A.J. Green out of Oklahoma State, 6'1", 190, tremendous length, 21 pass breakups, 6 interceptions in his career. This was a guy who, teams finally figured out they didn't want to pick on him. They went after Rodarius Williams on the opposite side. Pretty good length to him. I think he does a really good job, driving on the football, really good instincts. I think he can play both man and zone coverage as well. Has some pretty good skills. He's going to be somebody who's going to fly under the radar. I think a team's going to get a really good corner out of things when they ultimately select him. Safeties. We're in the home stretch. We're down to the safeties. And so when you're talking about the safety position, we had, 29 safeties at the combine. 11 of those weren't drafted. So when you're talking about that, you have 20 total safeties drafted, 18 of which were at the combine. So the safeties, if you're talking about safeties who were not drafted, weren't invited to the combine. Marcus Epps out of Wyoming, group of 5 guy who was very productive. I thought he was, pretty good athlete as well. Nick Scott was the other one out of Penn State, drafted in round 7. So, if you're talking about safeties that weren't invited to the combine, maybe a day 3 pick. There may be a couple of guys sprinkled in there, but I think, the combine, they usually do a pretty good job bringing in the guys that teams are going to want to keep an eye out for. The guys that weren't drafted, Mike Bell out of Fresno State, 6'3", 210, ran a 4.8, 340, looked really stiff. That was the big hitter. Lucas Dennis out of Boston College, just 5'11", 190, 4.64, looked pretty stiff. Dakota Dixon out of Wisconsin ran a 4.81. When you're 5'10", that's just not going to get it done. Malik Gant out of Marshall, one of the more physical safeties, ran a 4.63. So you're seeing a trend here. Some of these safeties, the stiffness really starts showing out. Mark McLaurin of Mississippi State, 4.7, 740. A lot of times it just, didn't really pop off, and really surprise you. And Andrew Wingard ultimately did not get drafted, but was making plays for the Jaguars left and right. Ran a 4.5, 640, better than average athleticism, 36.5-inch vertical leap. Ultimately was a guy that I think teams were underselling from an athletic standpoint, but he's a guy who just flies around to the football and makes plays, and he's somebody that I think is going to have a home there with Jacksonville for a while. So if we look at this year's draft class, and I should make mention from the safety position, Darnell Savage, Jonathan Abram were our first rounders. Marquise Blair and Nasir Adderley, Taylor Rapp, Thornhill, all taken in round number 2. Will Harris, Mike Edwards in round number 3, and then the surprise Chauncey Gardner-Johnson falling all the way to round number 4. All those guys making not only making a roster, but the majority of those guys starting for their team, and so that's something that when you're looking at the safeties, if you're being drafted in the first 3 rounds, you have a good chance to end up making an impact at year 1. When we look at this year's draft class, I think the first guy that comes to mind is Grant Delpit. This guy is the Jim Thorpe Award winner, and a guy who, look, as a sophomore, he was the beast, the guy that just was playing all over the field, 9.5 tackles for loss, 5 sacks, 5 interceptions, 9 pass breakups. He showed an ability to play in the box. He could drop into coverage, playing over the top. Then this past season, 18 missed tackles, but really a lot of the issues that he was running into primarily were the result of he was not healthy. He couldn't stay healthy. And when he's at his best, when he is healthy, he's going to end up making a lot of plays for teams. And so I think the 18 missed tackles, yes, that is a concern, but I want to see what he looks like as an athlete. How fluid of an athlete is he going to be at the combine? 6'3", 203. I think the junior is going to end up being the number 1 safety taken. If we're flipping from there, you got Xavier McKinney out of Alabama, 6'1", 200. The junior, tremendous ball skills. I think he has some cover ability. Can play in the box a little bit, not quite like to Delpit's level, but I think he's one of those guys. When you drop him into coverage, that's where you're really going to see things. I think he's going to be one of the guys when you're watching the drills that people are going to take notice of, and you're really going to be impressed. Antoine Winfield out of Minnesota. This is a guy who, I don't know how well he's going to test. I don't know that he's going to have the speed that people are expecting out of a safety. 5'10", 205. This is a guy who has, he played well in the box. Took tremendous angles to the football. 9 interceptions in his career, including 7 this past season. Plays well over the top, and just diagnoses plays in a hurry. He's got the pedigree. His dad, the same name, was a first round pick. He's not going to be a first rounder, but I think when you've got a guy, when you flip on the game film and you just see a guy making plays, that's a guy that you really, are going to take notice of. So, I'm curious to see what he looks like from an athleticism standpoint. That's really going to dictate ultimately where he's going to get himself drafted. As I scroll through, looking at some of these other guys, Rodney Clemens out of SMU, 6 foot 205, tremendous ball skills as well. 4 interceptions this past season, 27 total pass breakups. A guy who can be a weapon over the top. On the back end of your defense, Ashton Davis, this is a track guy. 6'1", 200. Really want to see what he's going to run, with his 40 time. Battled some injuries in 2019, but a guy who has really good ball skills, and that speed allows him to cover a lot of ground. He's going to be a second round pick in my opinion. There are two guys that are FCS prospects who have to be talked about. Kyle Duggar out of Lenoir-Rhyne, 6'2", 220, one of the bigger safeties. How big of a how good of an athlete is this guy going to be? That's going to be a huge question mark for me. Is how fluid is this guy? Is there going to be some stiffness? What are we really talking about here? Has 10 interceptions, 36 pass breakups, 6 forced fumbles, 6 fumble recoveries, with 237 tackles in his career as well. This is a guy who filled up the stat sheet for Lenoir-Rhyne, and a guy who has a chance to be a day 2 pick. The other guy there is Jeremy Chin out of Southern Illinois, 6'3", 212, and similar stats. 13 interceptions to his credit, 31 pass breakups, 6 forced fumbles. And so you look at those numbers, and is it just a matter of this is a guy playing over the top and poor quarterback play and quarterbacks struggling with their arm strength, and this is a guy who just was able to play over the top? That was one of the things that people talked about with Nasir Adderley, was just how quick was he? Is it just a product of poor quarterback play, or is he really, that good with those ball skills? I think there is still something to be said, but you look at Nasir Adderley and where he ended up coming off the board. He was a late second round pick, and I think that's where these guys, you can end up seeing both of these guys go, is probably late second round. But you want to see just how athletic they are, and that's going to be something that I'm going to be tuning in to watch for sure on the last day of the combine out on the field. Brandon Jones of Texas, definitely veteran. He's somebody that I think needs to have a big day if he wants to be taken in the first 3 rounds. Chris Miller out of Baylor. This guy was known to be a big hitter for Baylor. Just a tremendously physical safety, but how athletic is he really? J.R. Reed was a leader of the Georgia defense, and on the back end, and Jordan Fuller was another guy who I think for Ohio State was looked at as a guy that could really hold things down on the back end. Those are going to be 2 guys you want to see just how fluid of an athlete they are. Can they play in space? Are they going to be guys that can play over the top? Are we talking about guys that are just going to be more box performers? So those are going to be guys you're going to look at. Geno Stone out of Iowa is a guy who I think, this past season really had a breakout year. Question whether or not he should have come out, but a guy that I think teams are going to be keeping an eye on as well. Kayvon Wallace out of Clemson. I think he's going to be the higher drafted of the 2 Clemson safeties. 10 pass breakups this past season, 5 interceptions in his career. Shows off pretty good cover skills. I think outside of Darion Kendrick and AJ Terrell, Kayvon Wallace was a guy that you could really expect to line up in the slot and cover receivers, and I think that's going to get him drafted a lot higher than I think people might even expect. Tanner Muse out of Clemson. All you saw was stiffness when you watch this guy. He struggles with some stiff hips. You saw that in the ACC title game. You saw that against OU. You saw that, against Ohio State. You saw that against LSU. And he's a guy who's going to play downhill. Really, he's somebody that I'm looking at 6'2", and 230. May run a decent 40 time, but with all the stiffness, is he going to, he's not really going to be a safety. Is he going to be able to transition to the linebacker position? You look at a guy like Drew Tranquill, and he ended up, converting to linebacker, started his career as a safety. That might be in the future for Tanner Muse. So those are the defensive players that I'm really keeping an eye on. And when we talk about the special teams, you can't forget about special teams. Last season there were 7 players invited to the combine, 4 kickers, 2 punters, and a long snapper. We ultimately had 2 kickers and 2 punters drafted, and Matt Gay going in round number 5 to the Bucks. Austin Seibert from OU going to the Browns, also in round number 5. And then you had a couple of punters that really made an impact. for their franchises. Mitch Wishnowsky, just booming punts there for the 49ers. He went in round 4. And then round 5, Jake Bailey from Stanford going to the Patriots. Really a kickoff machine, booting him out of the back of the end zone, but also a tremendous punter as well. There are 12 guys. I'm sorry, I left out Austin Cutting out of Air Force. A 7th round long snapper. I think you're going to have a long snapper drafted in this year's draft class as well. So if I get to those stats here real quick, when we're talking about long snappers, we're going to get them out of the way. The unsung hero, you're looking at Blake Ferguson from LSU, 6'3", 235. He has a shot. But then you look at Stephen Wordle out of Iowa State. You're talking about the Manley Award finalist, Senior Bowl. One of those two guys you're going to end up seeing drafted. I think there's going to be a good chance that you end up seeing both of them drafted there in round number 7. When you're talking about the kickers, I think Rodrigo Blankenship of Georgia is going to be the guy that everyone is going to be talking about. Made 82.5% of his field goal attempts, 80 of 97 overall. He's someone to keep an eye on as a kicker. I look at the other kickers that are being invited: Tyler Bass, J.J. Molson. There'll be guys that I think will probably going to end up being undrafted free agents when it's all said and done. At the punters, I think Sterling Hoffrichter is somebody who 43.2 yards per punt. A guy who does a pretty good job pinning the ball in the inside the 20-yard line. Braden Mann of Texas A&M. I mean, look, 51 yards per punt in 2018. Averaged 48.9 yards per punt in his career. He's somebody to definitely keep an eye on. I think he ends up getting drafted. Has a chance of being drafted in possibly even in round 5. Nick, I believe it's Peckin, out of Bucknell, 6 foot 210, the FCS punter of the year, 2-time All-American. He's the Stats All-Decade team as well. Just an insane punter. When you look at what this guy was able to do, he averaged 44.5 yards per punt, but 72 that he killed inside the 20, and 118 punts. Let's see, that went 50 plus yards. So I think the biggest thing is the number of punts inside the 20-yard line. Teams want to kill that ball inside the 20. He's going to be someone to really keep an eye on. We had a couple of juniors that were punters that ended up entering the draft: Aaron Sipos and Michael Turk. I don't think either of them are going to get drafted. Tommy Townsend of Florida has an outside chance, but I think when we're talking about the special teams, I think you're going to see the long snappers potentially get drafted. I think the kid out of Bucknell as a punter, Braden Mann, Sterling Hoffrichter, when you're talking about the punters. And then from the kicking standpoint, I think Rodrigo Blankenship is really the one kicker I'm identifying as a potential kicker that's going to get drafted. He'll probably be a 6th or 7th round pick, possibly sneak into round number 5. And when you're talking about the kickers from a season ago, the productivity that you saw out of Austin Seibert, and then the way that Matt Gay kicked the football, he and Mitch Wishnowsky there at Utah, the ball just sounded different, coming off of their foot. And so that's really why I expected them to get drafted. They got drafted in round number 5. I think Rodrigo is probably going to be a 6th, 7th round pick when it's all said and done. So those are our defensive and special teams players that have the combine invites. And we've gotten through the majority of the 337 players who have been invited to the combine. Next week is the combine. It actually starts on Sunday. And then as we get through and we actually see the guys take the field, it'll be in prime time this year, doing things a little bit differently. And after the combine is over, we'll have our post-combine edition. We're going to talk about who really stepped up, who were the disappointments, who have some work to do. And from there, the post-combine mock draft will be the next thing that I'll be working on after that. So I hope everyone has a tremendous rest of the week. Enjoy your weekends as well. And we'll do it all over again after the combine. Enjoy the combine. It's really a lot of fun to watch if you haven't gotten to watch one yet. I'll be tuning in for sure. Hope you do so as well. For ReadyForTheDraft.com, this has been the Ready for the Draft podcast. I'm your host, Gregg Schutze. Hope you've enjoyed the content, and we'll talk again soon. Until then, take care, everyone, and I am out of here.